And now, Life at West Point 100 Years Ago by Joseph B. James. On a lofty plateau set in hazy blue mountains high above the winding Hudson is West Point. There, young Americans destined to command our armies have studied the art of war since 1802. There in 1944, our generals of the future are preparing themselves. If one could have a glimpse of West Point 100 years ago, he would see some striking differences from academy life today, as well as some equally outstanding similarities. Present-day tradition was already well established a century ago, although it has continued to develop. Already the basic curriculum and discipline which today characterize West Point had been developed. Colonel Sylvanus Thayer, the father of the military academy, had transformed the training post for the Corps of Engineers into an institution for the education of officers for all branches of the Army. In 1844, little change was apparent in the curriculum and methods established after 1817 by Colonel Thayer. His innovations had tended to minimize the political influence which had almost decreed the death of the academy during its first years. Still another step in this direction was the abolition in 1843 of the Civilian Board of Visitors, which had exercised general supervision through its visits and its reports to the Secretary of War. In its place was set up a special commission of Army officers appointed by the President. Among those who visited the academy in this capacity in 1844 were Winfield Scott and Robert E. Lee. Much of the continued evolution of West Point is due to the informed criticism of this military group. Appointment at the academy was much sought after, particularly by boys from the South. Because many of the cadets of the 1840s became generals on one side or the other in the Civil War, this fact was to be significant in the life of the nation. A young man considered himself most fortunate when family and friends had outmaneuvered all opponents and had obtained the prize. The warrant of appointment, however, was only the permit that allowed him to test by examination his fitness for admission. Armed with his official appointment, a candidate usually came up the Hudson by boat about a month prior to this initial ordeal. Immediately after reporting to the adjutant, he was placed in a section of prospective cadets under the guidance of picked men of the second class. These groups, composed of boys between 16 and 21 years old, were immediately introduced to elementary drill and were tutored in all the subjects in which they were to be tested. These entrance examinations, held each June, furnished the prospective West Point cadet his most vivid early impression of the United States Military Academy. Standards of proficiency have changed greatly in 100 years, but have remained relative to the general educational standard of the American nation. Boys of ability and application, but not necessarily of superior opportunity, have always been able to pass the entrance examinations at West Point. Not long after the period of this study, Jefferson Davis, as Secretary of War, refused to countenance higher standards of admission on the grounds that such a move would be undemocratic. Exclusion of boys of little educational opportunity, reasoned Davis, would tend to produce officers of an aristocratic stamp. The examination was framed primarily to test the applicant's knowledge of mathematics and his command of the English language. Recognized standards required that the cadet write a fair, legible hand, and that he perform with facility and accuracy the various operations of the ground rules of arithmetic, including the problems of reduction, of simple and compound proportion, and of vulgar and decimal fractions. So formidable was the reputation of these tests in the 1840s that many youngsters availed themselves of special training in schools widely known for adequately preparing cadet candidates. As soon as a youth had passed the examination, he was admitted on probation and was assigned a room to be shared with two others in one of the two barracks. Before he had time to reflect on his new status, however, he was hustled off by upperclassmen to help erect tents on the plain. There was no doubt about the eagerness with which the plebe applied himself to his first military duties. The task of cleaning newly issued muskets was pursued so energetically by the plebes that an upperclassman humorously expressed the fear that the new cadets would rub them to pieces in a day or two. Despite such absorbing activity, however, the new cadets' letters indicated a feeling of loneliness with which every college freshman of today is familiar. Hazing by the third-year men, added to the effects of rigid discipline, frequently made the plebe decidedly unhappy. He might even wonder if he were really glad that his name had been posted in the alphabetical list of those who had passed the entrance examinations. During his first month at West Point, George McClellan, who later commanded vast armies, wrote that he felt as much alone as if in a boat in the middle of the Atlantic. Not a soul cares for or thinks of me. Not one here would lift a finger to help me, ran his complaint. The rigorous military discipline was not conducive to a feeling of contentment. The high plain among the steep hills overlooking the Hudson was as picturesque as it is today, but the cadet had little opportunity to inspect the beauties of the landscape. His duties focused his attention on nearer objects notable for their lack of loveliness. His acquaintance with the parade ground, for example, was filled with impressions of dust and heat. The sand was continually sifting into his shoes, burning and sometimes blistering his feet. Drill shoes were generally regarded as too heavy and clumsy. Even his smart new uniform, contrary to what might be expected, added little to his pleasure. A student verse suggests one reason for this. Your coat is made, you button it, give one spasmodic cough, and do not draw another breath until you take it off. The gray uniform coatee, much like that worn today, was trimmed with black braid and profusely ornamented with ball buttons of brass. This close-fitting garment was surmounted by a high-standing collar. A vest, not now included, was used in cooler months. The long winter trousers that fastened under the shoes were also gray, but the summer pantaloons were of white drill, the only notable concession made to changing seasons. Though uncomfortably heavy, the cadet's full-dress hat was his pride and joy. Its high wool pompon extended above an already high-crowned leather cap. The everyday costume called for a plainer headgear of leather, and a light forage cap was furnished for use off-duty. White crossbelts intended to support bayonet and cartridge box added to the smartness of the cadet's appearance. The all-enveloping guard cloak was worn only when it was extremely cold or wet. The new cadet, living in one of the uncomfortable tents on the plain, looked with longing toward the unsightly stone dormitories to which he would move in September. Hot under the sun, damp and cold when it rained, these crowded summer quarters were far from attractive even to a healthy and adventurous boy. During those rare hours of freedom when rain prevented drill, he sat in one of the few dry spots on his tent floor and wrote letters using his camp chest for a desk. Written in such an uncomfortable situation, these letters often reflected more discouragement than enthusiasm. Initial despondency faded rapidly, however. Before long, the young soldier was able to respond to the 5 o'clock call of fifes and drums with less complaint from stiff and sore muscles. In a few weeks, everything appeared much brighter. That almost unattainable goal, the soldierly bearing, was not quite so impossibly difficult as at first. Now he could stand stiffly erect without unbearable effort, his shoulders thrown back, chest thrust forward, his head held high, chin drawn in, and eyes so fixed that his gaze met the ground 15 paces directly in front. Nevertheless, it was still hard to resist the temptation to glance up from rigid attention when the band passed in review. Guard duty, though still quite thoroughly denounced in private, was accepted in ordered rotation with somewhat less resentment. Military evolutions became more varied and hence more interesting as the plebes' first encampment drew towards its close. Even the older boys, who had admittedly had their hands full in boxing them to death, now relented somewhat in this traditional persecution. Although a cadet could not take an active part in the social affairs of his first encampment, he could watch with keen interest and look forward eagerly to active participation in the periodic hops and the great ball that marked the end of the summer encampment. Enticing reports of parties given by Mrs. Winfield Scott and her daughters for what the general's wife called her hardcore reached the plebe. Visitors, including young lady friends and relatives of the cadets, came often during the summer and stayed at the hotel on the extreme north portion of the plain. A galaxy of feminine observers was usually on hand to witness the morning parade, which terminated 3 hours of early drill. The girls were also interested spectators at the more impressive sunset parade when the entire battalion in full dress passed in review to the lively accompaniment of the band. At these parades, everything was formal and usually precise. One exception of record was when a pair of horses attached to a caisson ran away and streaked it about the plain at a great rate. At the end of August, the young cadet exchanged his tent for a room in either the grimy north or south barracks. These stucco-covered stone structures had both been erected before 1820. Old South Barracks had in its 4 stories 50 rooms. Each room, 13 by 10 feet, was usually occupied by 3 boys. The 12 additional rooms in the wings of Old South were for officers. Old North, a 3-story building, had 40 rooms, 25 by 19 feet, each occupied by 4 boys. Some of these crowded quarters contained an adjoining room where the boys studied and kept their arms. As enrollment varied, the number of boys in each room was occasionally less than indicated. In fact, at one time, the eccentric Thomas J. Jackson, better known by his later title of Stonewall, had a room to himself. To the newcomer, every inch of space in his room seemed to be utilized. Broom, dustpan, scrub brush, tin pail, pitcher, basin, washstand, and looking glass, all these items had to be arranged precisely according to regulations. They had been issued before the encampment and charged against the cadet's account kept in a little passbook. He had received his mattress at the same time, and after carrying it to his room in a clumsy ball, had deposited it with relief on his cot. The plebe had already become acquainted with some of the rules of the academy during that first summer. Now he began an intensive study of the book of cadet regulations, popularly termed prison discipline. Jubal Early's father had commented that these rules were more strict than I had any idea it was, or could be necessary to have them. This insistence on obedience to an exacting code and the weeding out of the unfit was part of the system developed by Colonel Thayer. Among major prohibitions, such as those against cards, whiskey, and tobacco, and many minor ones of all sorts, the cadets singled out for particular abuse the regulation that forbade all kinds of mustaches. A century ago, this seemed extremely harsh treatment to boys just approaching manhood. The superintendent, Major Richard Delafield, helped make things more pleasant for the young men by granting any permit within the bounds of reason. Old Dick, as the cadets called him, allowed them in their free time many enjoyable tramps in the mountains, including some to the Crow's Nest or to Buttermilk Falls. Bathing in the Hudson, like boating, was sometimes permitted. Old Fort Clinton, on the very tip of the point, was a scenic place of particular interest to the military-minded boys. The weathered walls of Fort Putnam, which rose across the plain, also invited closer inspection. The superintendent was the only figure on the cadets' immediate horizon who loomed larger than the commandant of cadets, whose office had been recognized by Congress as recently as 1840. His function was to unify the practical military instruction and drills of the cadet and to integrate these with the more theoretical studies. John A. Thomas, newly appointed commandant in 1843, was described by one of the boys as well over 6 feet and altogether a very handsome man. Because he had formerly taught ethics and because they liked him, cadets soon called him Ethical Tom. Some boys whom the commandant had assigned special Saturday afternoon tasks avenged themselves by flooding his office with water. Their temporary resentment having been thus abated, the natural attitude of wholesome respect reasserted itself. His eccentric conduct at drill caused much merriment in the ranks. It was reported that just before battalion drill one afternoon, Ethical Tom attempted to speak to the corps. After appealing to their military spirit in various ways, he concluded his remarks in this unexpectedly humorous manner. "You are not common soldiers, you are gentlemen. Gentlemen of manners, of politeness, and of education. The United States looks to you. The country looks to you, and by company, right wheel, head of columns to the left, guide right, quick march." These remarks of the commandant, expressing the professional officer's consciousness of belonging to a group with aristocratic ideals, illustrate one reason for much popular criticism of West Point a century ago. The leveling tendencies of the new democracy that rode the wave of westward expansion caused graduates of the United States Military Academy to be derided as puppets and aristocrats. Representatives of the people expressed in Congress the contempt of their constituents and proceeded to bait both the regular army and the academy. This attitude, coupled with the traditional American prejudice against standing armies, is further reflected in congressional agitation to reduce the size of the army, already less than 6,000 men scattered in 100 posts. The conflict between the administration of John Tyler and the adherents of Henry Clay, in addition to the usual inter-party strife between Whigs and Democrats, caused this issue to become a veritable political football. It has been said, with good reason, that had it not been for the Mexican War, which proved its practical value, West Point might have been abolished or seriously handicapped.